First of all, thanks for inviting me to speak. This is a really wonderful opportunity because I love the works in this exhibit and I really love the title, and I'm going to put a lot of energy just into talking about Carnation tonight. It's going to start out a bit abstract, so bear with me. I promise you it'll pay off. And I want to focus on three works in the exhibit and talk about them from three different angles of Carnation. So I'm going to start off by talking about the one that you see on the wall here without sound, Les Amis, and also Scène 2 that's in the back room. And then finally a work that's in the other room over here that's one of the sci-fi haikus. But first let me talk about why I just love the idea of Carnation. Carnation is a wonderful notion simply because it is very different from incarnation. When we think of incarnation philosophically and conceptually, incarnation is always this process of a spirit entering into flesh. It's some kind of idea moving into materials and forms. It's usually highly Platonic. It leads to a sense of the priority of formal ideas over matter and over material contingencies. And ultimately it leads to this kind of sense of disembodiment of a spirit that transcends the flesh of the world. We know incarnation best through its Christian exemplars, the incarnation of the spirit in the flesh, and we also know its Hegelian exemplars in history. History is the ongoing incarnation of the idea through bodies, institutions, and peoples. So incarnation is a view of creation and the creative act that always posits the creator above and beyond reality as some kind of godlike figure standing over and above her materials. So what I love about Carnation is it invites us to completely dispense with all that metaphysical baggage. Because Carnation promises something more like a performance or a process. It's an enactment that produces or discovers something. It finds what's happening in things. It lets them take on form. It might be described as emergence in that it allows for materials to speak, to act, to write themselves into the world. So in this sense, the artist becomes a midwife, ushering new beings, new modes of existence into the world, taking care of their passage, nurturing them as best she or he can. And these new existences prove disturbing, as I'm sure you noticed if you saw Scène 2, right? We have to ask ourselves if it's a new existence we want to live with. But even if these new existences are difficult to situate within our received pantheons, this exhibit invites us to see them as worthy of attention and of care. Put another way, this Carnation demands us to be worthy of the event of creation, to prolong it, instead of standing at some kind of site of origination and passing judgment. In other words, we're not standing back in the manner of God who found the creation was good. Carnation brings forth the leech children and takes delight in them. So this is my view of Carnation, first of all. It's a kind of process of iteration that's productive. It's not a reiteration, right? It's not Carnation over and over and over, or rather, it's more like the poem, a carnation is a carnation is a carnation. So we'll just call this a carnative process. And if we look at Hamelin's dancers, Les Amis, the one you see on the wall in front of you, and presumably now behind me, we can see how these dancers depart from and even defy the weighty baggage of incarnation, that is, the old tired inspiriting of fleshly bodies. Here we get a different view. First of all, you notice that in keeping with the digital, they're weightless. They don't really need to jump because they're already floating. So we have to ask ourselves why they're even jumping at all. They're also seemingly hollow. They're the lightest of plasticine shells, and the absence of eyes in their sockets seems to confirm that they're full of air, space, or something. We don't know. In any case, whatever they're full of, it's not meaty, it's not weighty. In fact, they may not even have muscles. We have a movement without musculature. So this effect doesn't come only of how the figures are rendered digitally. It's also coming through the way in which they're composited in the screen, which is to say this relationship between figures and the background is very, very open. There's a sense of non-relation between them. Even if we took these figures, though, and we put them in a photographic world or some other kind of world, we'd know they wouldn't be anchored into it. They wouldn't be sutured into it. They would continue to float because they exist in their own reality. And this reality just happens to be layered into a world of vibrant colors, aquamarine to lemon. So this use of intensive color in the background confirms this fact that this world, their world, is intensive. It's not extensive. It's really just not a world around them. In fact, if you look closely at the dancers, even in this image, the plane on which they're dancing is completely arbitrary. There's no particular reason for all their feet to be at the same level, right? In terms of what the background is feeding us. You can also see clearly in the stilled image that the circle of dancers has depth, but it's not really three-dimensional, nor is it really flat. We might call it 2.5D, but that doesn't quite capture it. It's just simply some kind of dimension between what we normally consider to be dimensions, some kind of emergent dimension. It's not so much a flattening of the 3D, or maybe it is, but at the same time it feels like something two-dimensional is coming to the surface. So there's this weird feeling of the 3D pushing away from us and the two-dimensionality coming forward at the same time. So generally speaking, you find a lot of these sorts of techniques and effects in digital animation, because digital animation, as we know, often focuses on motion capture, and motion capture captures motion. It doesn't capture weight. So any kind of critter that's captured with motion capture tends to feel like it's floating and hollow. So I think it's the virtue of Len's exhibit that he's putting a twist on this. He's not just bringing it to the fore, but he's trying to take it to another place. So I'll call this the carnative twist. It's his carnative performance. So first of all, we see that there are these kind of playful possibilities afforded by the digital facts of the matter. That is, if we look at their hair, the hair is clearly digitally composited onto the body. It's just layered and attached to them. But we can't treat it as a representation at all of hair. If we take it for a representation, clearly it's strange simply because it's purple and silver, but we also find it in strange places. If we look at the hair on the man, he has an odd tuft growing out of his arm, and then if we look closer, after calling him a man, we're not actually quite sure that's the term we should use. In other words, hair is doing something bizarre. Even more extravagant is the hair of one of the dancers, whom we'll call female, for the hair travels around her body as she bobs her head. In other words, hair, which is some kind of separate organ now from the human body, has taken on a degree of autonomy. Initially, you might think that she's performing with her hair, just making it travel around her body, but in fact, the hair starts performing. The hair is using the body as a platform or stage upon which to do its own dance. In other words, we quickly realize that there is no representation here. It's simply a semblance of hair. This is how hair feels, or hair might feel, under conditions of dancing. In other words, we get to the point in this exhibit of dancing where we realize it's not representing dancing at all. Dancing has been removed from bodies, so it becomes dancingness. And then dancingness can take up new bodies, in particular these digital bodies. So once we begin to understand that these are not really dancing figures, but dancingness that has taken hold of human forms, by the same token that we can understand that hair is not really a representation, we seem to reach this mode of asking, so if these entities resemble humans, what order of existence are there? Why do they even bother to look like humans at all? It's as if something has become a human semblance, and we don't really know why it's chosen to, if you will, have the semblance of the human. So in this respect, we might say Hamelin's dancing amis are akin to deities or spirits. They feel like they're non-human, but non-humans, for some reason or another, they appear to be like humans, but it's not like they really understand what the human is, clearly, and they may not really care about what the human is. It seems like the dancingness that runs through these human bodies attracts them, so they're attracted to dancingness, not really to humanness. And this dancingness precipitates them out of nowhere, coalescing them into some kind of humanoid form. The dancingness then is somehow excessive. It overflows the human body proper to take up its organs in this generalized event of dancingness. Now we can understand this, and I know this is a little bit strange and art historical for me to do, but I feel like if we draw a contrast with other ways in which dancing figures are rendered, we get to the heart of the matter. So going way back, we can take the example of a classical frieze of dancers. Conventionally, a circle of women dancers, these were used and they were sculpted on temples to adorn these sites where a goddess or a god would occasionally descend, as if drawn out of the heavens to the earth, supposedly to give some kind of boons to humans. But we notice in this kind of rendition of dancers, we have a sculptural depth and weight to the figures, even though the circle itself is flat. We can't really imagine the circle. They might be said to imply a circle. There's some kind of ritual field around the temple, but their world, the world of the dancers, is rectilinear, symmetrical, classical, as it were, balanced and harmonious. They clasp hands, and in fact, their hands can be sculpted to clasp. And this is really important. I'll come back to it. You'll note that the dancers here can't clasp hands at all. So it's easy to see why, in Western European Renaissance, these kinds of figures were taken to confirm humanism. That is, they somehow placed humans at the center of reality as if humans were godlike. That is, they were incarnations of the deity, incarnations of the god. Indeed, these dancers are not really just humans dancing. They're somehow humans who have become like the divine. They embody the grace and perfection of goddesses. So they're poised somehow between the domain of gods and humans to function as mediators, embodiments, and incarnations, the way in which the Word or the divine spirit might be made flesh. In other words, this is all about the use of a kind of classical depth of field to foreground the human. And it fell later, however, to neoclassical impulse to flatten this kind of classical depth, to explore its symmetries, harmonies, and equilibriums, but at the same time to level its hierarchies. So I want to just use the example of Matisse. So when we take the instance of Matisse's circle of dancers, this full circle as a circle is perceptible only by flattening it onto the plane of the canvas. This bold distribution of almost primary color produces an effect of compositing. We feel the layers of the image, and the dancers seem to hover above the field of green, whose roundness implies the horizon of earth, and so they seem to float dancingly between heaven and earth. And actually their circle then repeats the kind of roundness of the earth as well. The movement of bodies is felt in the torsion of the human forms. Their hands are clasped, they circle, and here there's a sort of communal circle that emerges. But the sense of community seems to demand some degree of neutralization of individual difference. That is, again, you can think of the problem of gender. It's not entirely clear what gender we're supposed to think these figures are, and it's not entirely clear they all are individuals. So Matisse, in this kind of art form, retains a good deal of the classical in this idealization of the commonality of human form, almost to the point of erasing certain kinds of distinctions. And this is surely why these kinds of neoclassical figures are the ones we often find in the Temple of Art, that is, in the art museum. They almost function in the same way as figures of dancers that appear on the temples. That is, they're summoning the powers of art with a capital A into the gallery. So it's not surprising even to see Matisse go to this, back to the classical frieze, right, where you can put the dancers around the art gallery. So to understand, I think, what is happening in this kind of exhibit of dancing, we need another kind of weight. It's simply not neoclassical, and it's simply not classical. And to me, the best example to think about it is this one. Another instance of something that's often described as neoclassical, that is the dancers of Margaret Morris. And I'm sure some of you have encountered this. There are, in this instance, is just photographs of his dancers, the dancers who are caught in a choreographic moment, which might be likened to a kind of motion capture. And here, in these photographs, in keeping with the demands of the stage, the circle has once again become a chorus line. It's a flat rendition, but the style is presentational. These dancers aren't representing the human body, and in fact, Morris transforms them into hieroglyphs and inanimate objects, into any kind of form that seems inanimate, because she wants to explore the way bodies can become inanimate. Arguably, these dancers really photograph well, right? They have these beautiful pictures of all of her choreography. It's because the bodies are already taking pictures of things with their bodies. In other words, they can turn into hieroglyphs with their silhouettes because these bodies are already inanimate. They're like cameras. They're taking photographs of the world, capturing meanings that elude us and that remain cryptic. And so each one can become an individual sign, even as they adopt similar kinds of poses. So some kind of equilibrium emerges here from the dance rather than the poses of the dance. As such, they do not clasp hands. This is not a literal physical circle. It's a community of affect. It's a kind of photography that takes up movements that's stopping on bodies, making them into signs in order to release some kind of potential from the bodies themselves. And I think that once we've seen these three examples, right, the original classical example, Matisse with his kind of decoupage style almost, and then finally choreography, we see something new about the digital. That is, we can return to these dancers with new ears and new eyes. This kind of dancer combines something of all of these three moments: the sculptural, the neoclassical flattening and decoupage, and the motion capture of these photo-friendly choreographers. They're sculpted yet flat. They form a circle that's not a circle but a plane, and their bodies turn into something like a hieroglyph that promises to orient us. In other words, and this is very common in digital art, but I think this is kind of a beautiful rendition of it. One of the things that characterizes the digital, of course, is it doesn't cite other media, it actually uses them as expressive forces. So arguably, what's going on in this kind of installation can be read at once as being sculpture, as being graphic art, and as being something like photography and choreography. So when we begin to see all of these different expressive forces combined into a single kind of media presentation, we get something new. That is, with these dancers that hover between sculpture, graphics, choreographer, and their 2.5D world, we see that what holds them together is this invisible plane that puts them all on the same footing. But strangely enough, when a dancer falls, the dancer appears from certain angles as if he or she has fallen off the common plane, as if the dancer had actually fallen into a different dimension of reality. Right? It's suddenly as if it breaks this kind of sense in which the dancers are all in a single field of perception. Her hand hangs out strangely below the plane on which they dance, and as the viewing position rotates, sometimes we see that she is on the same plane, but sometimes that we think that the plane is angled in order to make sense of what's happening with the act of her falling. Weird, right? So suddenly, because her hand is just out there, hands grab our attention. So we note that these dancers don't clasp hands. This is not how they form a circle, a community. Initially, they appear to be individualized to the point where they might even be said to be solipsistic. They're absorbed in their own dance. They're oblivious to the circle. Even if they could see one another, right? They don't have eyes, so in theory they don't see. They don't seem to be interested in seeing one another. Yet if someone falls, they lend a hand. So how do they even know someone has fallen if they don't have eyes? And how do they lend a hand if they can't use them? So this is the second problem of the hand emerging in this particular work. When we look at an image like this, we see that a closer view of contact within this circle of friends reveals that touch is not touch at all. That is, it's not touch in any usual sense of physical contact, for the hand seems to enter other bodies. And that's pretty clear here, right? In fact, hands pass through other bodies altogether. It is as if each of these bodies existed in its own reality, so individualized it can't have an impact on any of the others. It's unimaginable for these kinds of beings to hold hands. So how is it they manage not only to sense that a friend has fallen, but to lend a hand, as it were, like what's being staged or dramatized in this space? It's here that Hamelin's use of digital animation is bringing us to a different way of thinking about what a circle is, what a community is, and what communication might be. First, the circle is in fact a plane. We've already seen that, like kind of 2.5 circle, in which friends or friendship is emergent. Second, these friends don't really perceive one another. They don't see or touch one another, despite the fact that they're dancing very close. In fact, sometimes they're feel like they're right on top of one another. Rather, they're sensing each other. They feel the movement of the others. In other words, this is a community of affect in which each body seems to be absorbed in its own animation or absorbed in its own self-animating process, and yet it's related to other bodies through animation itself. In other words, to make the third point, their relation is not physical. They pass through one another, but they actually have a relation through animation. They have a common thing that's happening, a kind of event. And so if we return to the point of departure, this is what I'd call a carnative process. Digital animation allows Hamelin to work across the sculptural, choreographic, and graphic fields of art to arrive at another vision of the human. It's no longer humanist, to be sure, but surely this is not post-humanist. That is, it's not really a field in which the human was centered only to be decentered, and it's not really a field from which the divine has disappeared. His dancing circle of friends brings us to a threshold where something like self-carnation, that is, the self-animation of being, is related to the self-animation of a world. In other words, reaching the point where we can see animation making a worlding or an ecology. Still with me? It's fun, right? I love Carnation. So, second aspect of carnation, I'm going to call this personation, and move on to scène deux. So, scène deux draws inspiration from Jean-Luc Godard's film Le Mépris from 1963. And what we have in this installation is this, basically, a lot more. But what we have in effect is the music and the camera movement from a particular scene of the movie that's been extracted from the movie and reworked and applied to what appears to be a chunk of meat on a rug, at least initially, right? We think that's what it might be. A closer look shows that this meat is not really like meat. It may have been meat, we don't know, but it has been digitally rendered with smooth contours that impart an inorganic field. It might be meat, it might be chunks of red granite with quartz veins. Likewise, its bedding, or whatever it's lying on, might be a rug, or it might be grass. This could be a jumble of eroded rocks lying on a savanna, or it could be a chunk of meat lying on a piece of fur. We're not really sure. And in fact, what makes it kind of weird is you sort of want the fur to be on the meat somehow, but it's not. But come back to that. So what's striking about Emelin's take on or take from Le Mépris is how it repeats Godard's interest in the way in which cinema produces its objects. In other words, cinema doesn't film things, cinema produces things. It's not really an act of recording, it's an act of production. So music and camera movement transforms something apparently inert and not especially charismatic into something full of attraction, full of life. And this, of course, is what it looks like in the film. Brigitte Bardot, a beautiful young woman, lying on a lush shag carpet, and we sense, of course, something very different between this and this. In other words, there's something taken from Godard in the scene of using the body of a young woman in which he's saying, cinema can make Brigitte Bardot a star. She doesn't have to be attractive. She doesn't have to be charismatic. It's the music that makes her that way. It's the camera movement. It's this entire apparatus of cinema. But you can never take Brigitte Bardot out of it. Like, that is Brigitte Bardot. She is this entity now. And so we're getting something very much radicalized from cinema that I would argue is turning cinema into animation. And we can think of this again through the word carnation. Right? So if we take a carnation, like this kind of carnation, a flower, and we think of Brigitte Bardot as a beautiful flower of a woman lying there on her rug, but we can also think of carnation in terms of meat. Maybe Brigitte Bardot is just a chunk of meat for viewers, I don't know, right? So we have this other kind of sense of carnation, of the carnal, of the meaty, of the fleshly. And somehow they get combined into something that isn't really meat and isn't really a flower. And when you start to superimpose these kinds of ideas, the flesh and the flower, onto one another, you begin to see new kind of inorganic contours emerging. And I think this is the way we can think this kind of entity as a carnation, not an incarnation. In other words, I think that this installation does something very different from Godard, in that it's not only dealing with how movies can produce the starlet, it's now dealing with how movies produce personality. And really the question is here, can this entity, whatever this life form is or proto-life form is, does it have personality, and how do we bring personality to it? So there's a long engagement within film studies with animation that tries to explain this very process. It starts with Sergei Eisenstein. Sergei Eisenstein, in the late 30s and early 40s, became fascinated to Disney. In fact, he had to run to Los Angeles to meet Walt Disney, whom he considered the most avant-garde of film directors ever. And when he wrote on Disney, he said this. He said, the very idea, if you will, of the animated cartoon is like a direct embodiment of the method of animism. So Eisenstein doesn't define animism for us, but his discussion adopts a very familiar stance. I think we all know it anyway. That is, animism implies a worldview in which non-human beings, running the gamut from non-human animals to plants and trees to fire and water, possess an animating agency, which might also be construed as a soul, for it does not differ essentially from the animating agents of humans. So in one of the influential early accounts of animism that Eisenstein draws on, it's the one from Hallowell, he writes that among certain peoples, animals and other objects are believed to have essentially the same sort of animating agency which man possesses. That is, the animation of living things such as trees and non-living things such as stones or machines. They become endowed with a soul or animating force just like humans. In other words, this is the force that Disney finds at work in animation. Non-human beings become persons. This doesn't only apply to animals, but also plants, trees, waters, brooms, teapots, and all kinds of stuff. So I think the same thing applies to this carnation, this meat flower. The meat flower is becoming a person. Animation is generating a person-like being. It's imparting an animating agency to all kinds of things, right? It could do a lot more than just pick up this particular thing. And if we think of animism more from a contemporary perspective, that of Linda Hogan, she would write that animism requires an active attention, the acknowledgement that all are sentient beings and the smallness of our own being in this world of a living, ongoing life force. Similarly, Danny Neva and Nuremberg David see in animism a shift in how we perceive things. What may appear as a thing to a mind infused with typificatory schemes and non-immediate considerations may appear as a person more than a thing to a mind available to perceive it in its utmost vividness. In other words, there's a way in which I think this installation is so good at taking cinematic techniques to produce a personality, to actually endow something with a soul, and then to make us begin to challenge the divide that we establish between the person and the human. This is something that's at stake in animism. Animism doesn't produce a new cosmos full of human things. It's not anthropocentrism. What it proposes is a new mode of address to the entire world of non-human beings as persons. So as another commentator puts it, Morrison, animism organizes life around the existence of persons, human and otherwise, rather than around materiality. Right? So again, we see how the digital is so useful because it gets us away from the materiality of objects, which is precisely a move people think is dematerializing, but in fact we can think of it not as dematerializing. In fact, it's personating, it's producing persons out of entities. In other words, we reach the point where Hamelin, right, animism, makes us make a distinction between the human and the person. We have to make a distinction between anthropomorphism and what we might call personation. That is the generation of persons, that is a kind of ontology or ontogenesis, as well as careful attention to personness. That is, it evokes this sort of relational epistemology in our relation to the image itself. This is how animation generates incipient persons. Another early film theorist is very interesting here, Jean Epstein. He saw this animic or animistic effect at work in moving images in general, and he actually characterized cinema as polytheistic and theogonic in its manner. He wrote that it's a matter of summoning objects out of the shadows of indifference into the light of dramatic concern. He writes, if we wish to understand how an animal, a plant, or a stone can inspire respect, fear, or horror, the three most sacred sentiments, I think we must watch them on the screen. Epstein speaks to the process of personation, remarking that cinema confers life to things and beings in the guise of personality. In other words, he says, cinema is never about intelligence, it's not about being smart. He says it's literally cinema goes beyond intelligence. Personality is what it's after. Personality is the spirit visible in things and people, their heredity made evident, their past become unforgettable, and their future already present. And I think this is a really good lens to read the second aspect or phase of Carnation, that we're invited to take some kind of polytheistic stance on objects. We have a kind of intuition about cinematic movement, about music, and motion together with it that adds something to animation, that is dramatic concern, that out of something completely impersonal emerges a kind of drama. So this brings me to our third carnation, the haiku. So if we think of Carnation from yet a third angle, we can address this dramatic concern in a different way. That is, if our sort of chunk of meat on the rug or whatever it is being endowed with this personality, We can also see that this creates a proto-narrative. If you sit and watch that installation, you always get the feeling it's a movie, something's about to happen. You may be disappointed or maybe not. In other words, there's kind of a proto-drama or a proto-story that seems to be not coming from the outside of these things, but actually somehow embedded with them or part of their accompaniment. And this is something that his series called Sci-Fi Haiku plays with a lot. Now, haiku, I think, is a really nice trope for understanding this, and that in our classic understanding of haiku, a haiku is a poem that functions by juxtaposing two images that otherwise would have no relation, such that the reader or listener would have to create a new space in which that relation can exist. A very famous example, at least in the realm of North Atlantic poetry, is Ezra Pound's poem, Faces in the Metro, Petals on a Wet Black Bough. So what is the connection between Faces in the Metro and Petals on a Wet Black Bough? We realize that Faces in the Metro could have their kind of story. They could have their own impetus and drive, their dramatic concern, but Petals on a Wet Black Bough have a different dramatic concern. Now, the whole question of haiku that Pound captures in that English language poem is how do these two different relations then come to relate? How do two different dramatic concerns enter into a space in which they can happen together? So in the original Japanese version of haiku, haiku are usually about places, which seems counterintuitive. Why would a haiku be about a place? In fact, usually to compose haiku, you're supposed to go to a famous place. But the whole idea of the haiku is to realize when you're in that place, it's not the place you are, right? It's the place in the poem that is the place. So it's always asking you to make these kinds of impossible leaps across two sets of relational concerns, two kind of potentials for drama that remain disjuncted, and yet you have to realize them in the act of poetry or in the act of listening or reading. So in his haiku series, Amlan adopts something of this perspective. On the one hand, we have what initially might appear to be the story of a prism. And it's a prism that turns. It's beautifully kind of rectilinear and delineated, volumetric, geometric. It kind of floats in space and turns. It may be a story. It moves across the screen. So maybe it's traveling, maybe it's going somewhere. In any case, we get the sense that this is endowed with a personality, as uncharismatic as it might seem. It's been given a kind of personality, so it has a dramatic concern. And we're asking ourselves, where does it go? But he cuts instantly to a completely unrelated kind of scenario. And when you pay attention to it, this is a scene with sound. The other one is silent. So this is a train rushing down a track, and we hear that sound of a train rushing down the track. And we're instantly asked, what is this? Well, is it traveling that relates them? The prism is kind of traveling, the train is traveling, but the train is traveling in such a way that it's almost at the limit of cinema, right? It's just pure ballistic movement straight down the tracks. It feels like pure acceleration and speed, and yet we have this entity that kind of floats through space. It's very nonchalant, right? It's taking on this other kind of personality, and yet we cut back suddenly to the train rushing down the tracks. And we're even getting two different takes on what perspective can be. We're getting this forced Cartesian perspective, right, to a vanishing point, like rushing towards something, where the prism, for all the fact that it's in a geometric space, has no coordinates to follow. We're not really sure why it would go where it goes. In fact, as we begin to follow it, we're not exactly sure what its light source is. So we get this kind of image, the prism wandering, and then suddenly another prism. So what's going to happen? Maybe they'll meet. What kind of story is this? Maybe it's a love story? I don't know. Right, so this is what's interesting about this style of haiku, is it's inviting us to pursue the story, and then we instantly cut back to another kind of frame of reference, and we're in the world of sound, speed, the train. But we begin to feel a kind of bleed between these two images, that is, or these two modes of doing moving images. We begin to ask, well, maybe the train is going somewhere. If the prisms are encountering, maybe the train is encountering. And in fact, as these two prisms encounter and start to move together, the train itself begins to make an encounter. Here we see them still floating, interacting, the train moving down the tracks, and suddenly there's a light. In other words, if these are science fiction haiku, it's because we really have an encounter that takes the haiku to a new kind of dimensionality. Literally, we actually have a relation or a non-relation between two different takes on what our media reality is. Is our media reality this kind of geometric, volumetric space of digital animation, or is it this softer kind of video imagery of camera work that we associate with the legacy of video itself? So even if this train's moving at hyperspeed and accelerating, it's a different kind of field in the world it creates. So like the haiku then, we're balancing between these two images, asking to find a place in which the two can meet. So as the prisms begin to meet, we think, aha, maybe we are going to the same place. The prisms are meeting, the train is going towards something, some kind of light. Prisms are coming closer and closer together. The light on the track is coming closer to us. The prisms are slowly coming closer together to the point where they actually fuse. And you think maybe this is the end game, but in fact, as soon as they fuse, we see they are a block. So this tonality from this one kind of dimensionality of reality does feel like it bleeds over into the train scene. But now suddenly the train scene is silent. There's no sound. So it feels like it's the world of the prisms. And a light is approaching us. And in fact, we now see the light is the train. So we have to ask ourselves, are we a train hitting a train? Right? I mean, in other words, this tonality of two prisms, actually, are the trains like two prisms that are going to, and what will they do? Do they crash? Or do they kind of sidle up to one another and sort of play around and move in space? We're not sure, but we get the light. So this bright light becomes the same tonality as the two blocks fusing. And this cut back and forth between these two kinds of modes suddenly creates a moment where the sound is transferred from the train scene into the block. So now the block has the sound of the train, and it begins to retreat from us as if it were the train itself. So the kind of question I want to pose about this, which I think that it poses really well in the space of a haiku, is we have two potential stories. We could almost see them in the history of cinema as parallel cutting, right? Like you have your chase scene and then you have your scene back home and you go back and forth and you feel the tonality of the two affecting one another. Except unlike cinema, this doesn't really allow for a resolution or a convergence that synthesizes anything. In other words, we have a thoroughly non-dialectical procedure going on. Even though we always have two entities, and two entities meeting two other entities, and then two entities with two entities meeting, they don't actually add up to something like a synthetic moment where we'd say this is the end. Obviously, it can loop. It can simply start from this receding point that could be the train again rushing down the tracks. So in this sense, it poses a new dimension of the digital in terms of story. We no longer really have narrative in the usual sense of a teleology that is building to a kind of resolution, but we still have narrative or something like it. We still have story. We still have ways in which dramatic concerns begin to create focus and allow us to follow objects and partake something of their life. But in fact, we now see that there are these kinds of multiple dimensional stories, right? You really feel that impact of the digital in the way it can create different lines of narrative through the same piece of work. Right? So you wouldn't have one way of telling this, but actually multiple ways. And so when we get to this sort of disjunction in the space of story itself, a kind of disjunctive synthesis that is leaving the space open for us, we can ask, is this a parallel world in which, in fact, it's just tonality that passes over? And it brings us back in many ways to this exhibit again, this question of touch. We have now this question of a touch that's not a touch, that is a tact, right? Where two things are reaching closer and closer to one another. They can have an impact, but that impact can't be physical. They can transfer tonalities at this level of affect, but they're not going to make a physical exchange like here's $2, right? So it's going to remain at this other kind of level. In fact, they couldn't really exchange perception because they can't see one another, they can't touch one another, they can't hear one another, but somehow something is transferred across these two different spaces. And this transfer can create, as in the first work, this kind of new sense of what a circle is, what friendship is, what community is. Or as in the work on Sendu that follows the Godard film, you can suddenly create this sense of all of these objects outside the usual realm of the human may in fact be persons and worthy of our concern and therefore dramatic moments, so inviting us in an animistic way to think about a relation to the world that wouldn't just be about manipulating things, but actually prolonging this kind of personal dramatic concern. And then finally we get to this point where Carnation turns into a new design for storytelling, where we don't reset as in a video game. We actually allow stories to run in parallel such that the tonalities overlap with one another and you can have new forms of exchanges. So I want to end on that note and potentially for questions or discussion with this kind of composite of Carnation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was lovely and very meaningful reading of all these works. So I'm just trying to tie some concepts, some ideas together, not formulated at all. But I was thinking also about the presence of you mentioned non-human entities, and so I'm trying to think of the meat and of course the entity that's tied to that, which is the animal.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could speak to that when you're speaking about persons of concern within this ecology that you've illuminated for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because I was asking myself that as I was thinking about this question through the work. Because normally when we think of people creating dramatic concern around non-human objects, we instantly associate with a kind of politics. So there is politics of animism, and it often relates to ecological environments, say, let's treat rivers as persons, right? Which would change the way in which we formulate the politics of dealing with ecological crisis. Or we could say in the context of animals and environmental ethics, the same thing, that as soon as you posit animal as a person, then it totally shifts the way in which you would interact with an animal. But I think maybe what the power of this art is, and maybe I would hazard to say it's the power of art in general, is the kind of object that we're given in that exhibit actually is hovering between kinds of life forms. So it has a power of the monstrous. It's not super monstrous though, right? But it's actually giving us an object then that could be the animal. It could be the ecology because, you know, flowers often evoke something ecological in just their reproductive cycle and the kinds of things they inhabit. But then it's also invoking something else. It could be a rock, right? I mean, really, to me, like you were just in Australia, it looks like Aries rock or something, right? Just rising above some kind of natural scene. So I would place more the power of that as an ethical challenge, right? That even though we can situate ourselves in these very specific politics of the animal or of the ecology in specific places, that in fact all of those entities will end up layered with other entities, right? And you can dramatize that concern with this digital fusion of modalities, right? Where it is sculptural, it is graphic, it is kind of a decoupage, it's doing all these things at once. It allows you to layer the non-human entity in such a way that it has that more powerful force, I think, in kind of ethical dimension of what it's doing. That's what you're asking? Okay, I hope.
Thanks. Hi, Tom. Thanks for this. This was really amazing. There are two dimensions of your talk that two dimensions of this piece actually that I didn't really. I think I didn't hear about. One is the formation of these sort of, I don't know, known entities, bodies, persons, which is quite evident in the piece. And the other dimension of this piece that I think is inevitable to grasp, especially if you're sitting beside while I was listening or watching, is the fact that they come on to you. So there is this sense almost like of the dance being not just on a plane or but it's also the fact that there is a sort of a sense of almost the dance almost being, I don't know, inviting almost a certain kind of interaction with, with the onboard. So two aspects that I would like you to comment on: the deformation of whatever these entities are, and then the fact that there is a sort of like a sense of foregrounding and being very much explored.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't really talk about the movement, right? Because there are two things happening with movement. On the one hand, you could say the viewing position moves around the figures or they're turning, right? So it's kind of a relative movement. We don't know where it would be coming from, which is something you can do with a simulated camera. But as you say, there's also these moments, right, of zooming where the full image comes out at us. And I think what interested me about that, I think it fits in with this kind of problem that I was just calling 2.5 dimensions, that as the figures come forward to us in kind of a volumetric digital world, you would expect to see enhanced depth, but actually as they come to the fore, they get deformed, and their deformation is not volumetric, it's flattened. So I constantly get the feeling from the way in which this plays with movement, it's as if when you try to move into depth, into the 3-dimensional depth, it actually turns out to be 2-dimensional. It's actually flatness that comes to the fore. And then as soon as you think it's flat and it kind of starts to recede, it starts to take on depth again. And so that play is really interesting because it's as if the whole circle becomes a body that's like the body of all the individual dancers, like in a different register. So I feel like that movement becomes, at least to me, expressive of the relationship between the individual bodies that can't be physical. Right? So that movement itself as a kind of force that doesn't have like physicality in the same way, I think becomes very important to thinking how the exhibit works on us. And I think at that level it's also really crucial, and I guess I didn't say this clearly, so I'll just clarify. I mean, we often think of digital technologies as dematerializing, which they easily do, right? They easily kind of strip away concreteness, and they easily strip away physicality, particularly of the kind where we think about gravity and physical parameters that are so easy to capture on photography. So there's a way with the digital, what I liked about this is that it actually potentializes that. So it doesn't become just dematerialized, it actually becomes a way to materialize interdimensionality. And then it feels like the interdimensionality is what, the friends à l'infini, right? To infinity. Did that answer, sort of? Do you have another idea? Because other interpretations would be interesting too.
No, I think that there's also something else to say as to the fact that you don't position yourself with regards to this piece. And I was thinking about what kind of difference it makes if I stay like this,
right,
sitting vis-a-vis, whether it just moving around or watching there's something to say as to how you actually position yourself. Vis-a-vis this, if I'm talking, I'm sort of
yeah, so it looks different.
So there is a sense in which the piece invites you to engage with the foregrounding movement, and also the ways in which the movement itself is invited within the piece, and also invites the onlooker to move around and engage with this movement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really great point. I mean, what I was thinking of in that respect, I mean, this kind of positionality it affords is when you first look at it and just kind of watch it, you don't realize that figures are interacting in a way, but it's not really an interaction. It's more of this kind of intra-action where something in each of them is speaking to the other figures, but not at the level where you could really isolate it and talk about it. So it seems that literally to invite you to look through the work, like to adopt different lines of sight through it. And I feel like those moments where it's turning and opening up actually do that. It kind of invites you not so much into it as kind of to take a line through it, almost like a radial kind of movement, right? Like you could traverse it in various ways. And a bit like the haiku, you could actually construct different proto-stories out of the way you would move, like through the work in that way.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I don't know much about the artist's creative process, but I would be interested in knowing your thoughts about, like, because it would be very different. You mentioned mocap and that the idea of motion being captured from a quote unquote real human moving body and then being used to animate an animated figure versus if, for example, this is a sort of keystroke choreography using a mouse on a computer screen to manipulate these digital bodies. It's quite a different process. And not that it matters in the final product necessarily, but when we're talking about these kinds of circuits of affect and the interactivity of the project, it's interesting to me to think about the kind of puppetry of these. Not to say that they don't have an animism in themselves, but yeah, the manipulation of these digital bodies into what sometimes looks like agony. You know, there's a kind of a violence there as well. So,
yeah, again, that's a really brilliant comment. I mean, one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about but didn't fully develop because it seemed a bit abstract is I would say, you know, with this kind of keystroke animation, literally the process of animation is limited to a finger. And there's a reason why when you see hands moving through things, it's almost like hands become fingers. So, you know, a poking finger is a kind of violence, and it's a space in which it feels like, you know, you have the violence of a keystroke amplified in some ways. Mm-hmm. But it's never a full violence, right? Like it passes through things. So, I mean, to answer that question, I think it that way. It's not, that's the difference between a kind of motion capture, which has this really weird kind of eroticism of the body and a full capture that, you know, brings with it other kinds of dimensions. But it's at that level, I would think, the digital literally as one finger, you know, moving you through the work. And I think it goes well with this kind of line of sight too, which could either be taken as an invitation or really kind of an invasion of this space of friendship.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Thomas again for everything.